Welcome back. We're going to go over the lecture on Chapter 3 on Rome and the Empire of Rome. It's titled Empire, the Power, and the Glory of Rome from 500 BCE to 500 CE. We looked at the Greeks, and we should remember that Greek culture is going to be very, very important when trying to understand who the Romans are as well. They are taking similar aspects in their art, they are taking Greek philosophy, but they also have different sensibilities. And I think one of these sensibilities is they're a little more militant, but they're also really good at bureaucracy and things like modern law and architecture and civil planning, aqueducts. These are things that the Romans are very, very good at. We will take a look at the subjects that are in the chapter and in the illustrated lecture that I have for you. You'll have an assignment where you'll do a reading assessment. Make sure that you're thorough in your answers. And then depending on whether or not this is a summer or fall or spring class, you will have a discussion. If this is a summer class, the discussion is optional, meaning that it's not extra credit that you'll be graded on it. But if you don't do it, you won't get a 0 either. And then if this is a fall or a spring class, it is mandatory to do the discussion, which is a comparative response to sculptures, and we will look at the veristic male portrait and Augusta of Prima Porta, and I will also reintroduce you to the Greek orders of their sculpture as well. So let's get into the lecture. So as I said earlier, Rome is a fountainhead of urban civilization. This is Rome here at about 320 CD or CE in the Common Era, also known as AD, depending on how old you are. We have from the Romans the transmission of the Greek legacy and also the continuation of classicism. And what we get from Rome is our alphabet, the Latin language, law, architecture, and these things, of course, between the Greeks and the Romans, very, very important to Western society. This is a reconstruction of Rome at its height, where it would have been about 1 million people. After the fall of Rome in 476, there are as few as 10,000 people living in the ruins of Rome. In fact, the Colosseum was used for herding and keeping sheep. So here we can see the Palatine Hill where the emperor's palace is. Rome will go from a republic into having emperors during its empire, in its imperium stage. We see here the Circus Maximus, where they would have had things like chariot races. We see a couple examples of aqueducts, which is a unique Roman engineering that would bring in water from many, many miles away for drinking, bathing, and of course the bathhouses, which were social places in Rome. We also see here the Colosseum, and the Colosseum is where there will be great gladiator events and the execution of prisoners. It's a very violent kind of warlike society. And then there are various temples also that we're seeing here. And then the smaller buildings would be the apartment buildings or the insulars. When we think about Roman culture, we think about the types of homes that the wealthy people would have lived in, open courtyards, a patriarchy that is a pater familias, that would be the idea of the male of the family and that they kind of run the household, but also a central courtyard where, depending on the male's influence, they can be reached for things like favors and business deals, other stuff like that. The Romans definitely, like the Greeks in terms of their art and philosophy, but also feel that the Greeks were a little soft comparatively. And so cultured Greek household slaves are teaching Roman youth in the time of Augustus, sometimes even girls. They're chefs, decorators, secretaries, doctors, hairdressers, all coming from the east from the Greeks. Now, where do the Romans ultimately come from? They are Iron Age people called Latins who invade the Italian peninsula after the beginning of the first millennium BCE. And by the mid-century of the 8th, by the mid of the 8th century, they had found the city of Rome in the lower valley of the Tiber River, a place that is strategically located for control of the Italian peninsula with convenient access to the Mediterranean Sea. While central Italy became the domain of the Latins, the rest of the peninsula received a continuous infusion of Eastern Mediterranean people. So we have influences from the Etruscans, the Greeks, and also the Phoenicians from modern-day Lebanon. Here we're looking at the Roman Empire at the height, Rome being here, and you can see that they have conquered Sicily, northern Africa, Egypt, the Levant, also Persia. They have conquered Turkey and also France and Spain and Great Britain, a massive empire that was run by a very effective bureaucracy. One of the origin myths, and a myth, is that Romulus and Remus, the two little boys here, founded Rome. And they did so on the Palatine Hill. According to Etruscan ritual, they began with a pomerium, or a sacred ditch. They then proceeded to make the walls, and ultimately Romulus is going to kill his brother Remus when Remus jumps over the wall, breaking the magic spell of the wall. The two twins were abandoned and brought and suckled by a wolf and ultimately reached adulthood. Is there anything more masculine and more warrior-like than being brought to out of childhood and kept alive to adulthood than being suckled by a wolf? And I think that that's clearly what they're trying to do here. Now, the idea that Romulus kills his brother Remus, I think this is an important lesson here, that what this means is that the city of Rome is more important than blood. And I think that that origin myth has a really interesting implication in terms of what the Roman mindset is. The Etruscans. So from the Etruscans, and we're looking here at an Etruscan temple, and we're also looking at a sarcophagus that is Etruscan. And you may notice that the faces, the strange smile, have some very similar qualities to the Koros and the Kore in terms of not being based on a specific human, but having a human essence to it. So from the Etruscans, the Romans are absorbing the fundamentals of urban planning, chariot racing, the toga, bronze and gold crafting, and the most ingenious structural principle of Mesopotamian architecture, the arch. So the Etruscans provide their dead with tombs with richly decorated interiors that are designed to resemble lavish places of the deceased, lavish dwelling places. On the lids of the sarcophagi that held the remains of the dead, they carved life-size figures that would have been brightly painted depicting husbands and wives relaxing and socializing on their dining couch, as if still enjoying a banquet. From the Greeks, the Romans are borrowing the gods and goddesses, changing the name. They're borrowing linguistic and literary principles and poetry, and their theater as well. They are borrowing the aesthetics of the Greek classical style. And from the Greeks, they are also borrowing the philosophy and the arts. From the Phoenicians, they are borrowing the alphabet that the Greeks also borrow, and their commercial and maritime skills. We have another origin myth here that comes a bit later, an Augustan origin myth, the Aeneid by Virgil. And in the Aeneid, we are seeing a type of origin myth that is showing that the Greeks are in fact Trojan, and that their origin and their warlike community has a Trojan kind of essence to them. The Roman Republic, from 509 to 133 BCE. So in 509, the Latins overthrow the Etruscans. They create a government of the people, an agricultural population that consisted of a powerful class of landowners known as the patricians, and the more populous class of farmers and small landowners known as the plebeians. The plebeians constituted the membership of the popular assembly. This body conferred civil and military authority, the imperium, upon two elected magistrates called consuls. Its lower class members had little voice in government, and the wealthy patricians were life members of the Roman Senate and controlled the lawmaking process. But slowly, the plebeians are going to gain increasing political influence and leverage their service as soldiers in the Roman army and their power to veto laws initiated by the Senate. The plebeians, through their leaders, the tribunes, will make themselves heard and eventually win the freedom to intermarry with the patricians and the right to hold executive office. And finally, in 287 BCE, the privilege of actually making laws. So almost no sooner had Rome become a republic than it adopted an expansionist course that would erode a lot of the democratic achievement. Obedience to the Roman state and service to the powerful government is essential, and by the 3rd century, they will have united all of Italy. They will fight several different wars, and in these wars, we will have the Punic Wars against the Phoenicians. That ends in the destruction of Carthage in North Africa, and then they will then take the naval and political leadership from the Phoenicians to the Western Mediterranean. Despite the difficulties presented in the task of governing such far-flung territories, the Romans proved to be efficient administrators. They demanded from foreign provinces taxes and soldiers to serve in their army, tributes and slaves. Roman governors appointed by the Senate will form from the higher ranks of the military, ruled within the conquered provinces. Usually local customs, even local governments, were permitted to continue unmodified. The Romans introduced Latin language, Roman law in the provinces, building paved roads, making aqueducts for fresh water and bridges, and eventually granting the people they conquer to become Roman citizens. So Roman foreigners who want to become citizens will serve in the military, and that would mean that their children would be allowed also to become the citizens of Rome after serving in the military for 25 years. The collapse of the Republic from 133 to 30 BC. As the Senate became increasingly powerful, a new class of wealthy Roman entrepreneurs are filling the jobs of provincial administration. The provinces are also becoming more powerful. They are getting more precious metals and slaves and booty from foreign conquests. Captives of war are shipped back. They are using slave labor. And we're slowly beginning to see the disappearance of the small farmer that will signal the decline for the Republic. In 46 BCE, a army commander named Julius Caesar will enter the city of Rome after conquering Gaul or France and Belgium, and he is going to decide that he wants to consolidate the government. He is going to kind of disband the power of the Senate, and he is also going to reform laws by consolidating them, regulating taxation, reducing debt, and sending large numbers of unemployed proletariat overseas to colonies, and also inaugurating public works, big, huge projects, which Roman emperors will continue to do as a way of finding a common good and also a way of showing their power and their wanting to show the Roman people that they want the best for them. So he is going to become dictator in perpetuity. In 44 BC, he is going to be assassinated by a group of senators led by Brutus. A bunch of civil wars are going to break out. And then ultimately, his first lieutenant, Mark Antony, and his grandnephew and adopted son, Octavian, are going to take power, and they are going to contest each other, but it'll be resolved in the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, when Octavian's army will rout the combined forces of Antony and Egyptian Queen Cleopatra. In 43 BC, Octavian will usurp consulship, and he will share legislative power with the Senate, but retains the right to veto any legislation. He will become the first emperor, and he will usher in the Pax Romana, or the Romanic peace, from 30 BC to 180 BC. Cicero is a Roman philosopher, politician, lawyer, orator, political theorist, consul, and constitutionalist. He will be rediscovered by Petrarch in the Renaissance, and he will write things about what the purpose of life should be, and also following the role of the philosophy of the Stoics, where you will not gripe and that you will do the things that are expected of you. In Roman law, because of the sheer size of the entire empire, Roman law and justice evolves out of a practical need to rule. And they are going to be inspired by the roles of Solon, and they are going to publish their first civil code, the 12 Tables of Law, around 450 BC. So what we're going to get from them are the praetors, the magistrates who administer justice, and jurisconsults, experts in law, who will interpret the law and bring common sense resolutions to private disputes. They will constitute a body of case law. In giving consideration to individual needs, magistrates cultivate the concept of equity, which puts the spirit of law above the letter of the law. Roman law is not fixed, but an evolving body of opinions and nature and the dispensation of justice. From the Romans, we get the Humanities from Cicero, describing the ideal speaker, and how the ideal speaker is about cultivation, about cultivation of the senses, about what you know, and being a moral, well-speaking person who faces a life of courageous skepticism and is very important to Roman civic life. In Cicero's On Duty, if I can go back to this, he is evaluating the benefits of diplomacy versus war as well, and that the friendly settlement of controversy is more desirable than courage in settling things on the battlefield. So I think this is also a very kind of important idea in terms of thinking about how the Romans themselves are relating to their own disputes. They don't want to break up their empire in civil war. Philosophic thought, the Romans are adopting Epicurean and Stoic thought. They are believers, the Stoics are believers in detachment and acceptance. And they believe that there is an impersonal God and that this God has really no interest in their lives other than their creation. We are getting poetry and satire from Juvenal. We're getting his satires kind of making fun of the Roman elite and the beliefs of many contemporaries and their value systems by using making a kind of shadow real world showing how ridiculous things can be. He is writing from 60 to 130 CE. These are bitter and devastating, and he is looking at a state that is swollen with greed and corruption and painting Rome as a picture of noisy, dirty, crowded urban community with selfish, violent, and self-indulgent people. Epicureanism. In Epicureanism, we have a belief in not hedonism, but pleasure is the greatest good. And that's certainly something we find in the Romans. They do love their baths. They do love their wine. They do love their sport and their getaway. And that life should be something that is enjoyed. And this is coming from a Greek philosopher, Epicurus, around 307 BCE. And he is also an atomic materialist, following in the steps of Democritus. His materialism led him to a general attack on superstition and divine intervention. In poetry, we get The Art of Love by Ovid. And Ovid is a how-to manual in how to gain a lover and keep the lover. It has a lot of misogynist qualities to it, but it also kind of has a spirit of understanding that you shouldn't forget your lover's birthday, let her miss you but for not too long, don't ask about her age. And the third book is giving similar advice to women, including making up but in private, being wary of false lovers, and trying young and older lovers. He likens love to military service that requires the strictest obedience to women, and advises women to make their lovers artificially jealous so that they do not become neglectful through complacency. In the love poetry of Catullus, he is writing about consumed with subjects in a very kind of intense but short life about friendship, love, and sex. In his seductive poems to Lesbia from 60 BCE, he writes, "Come, Lesbia, let us live in love, nor give a damn what sour old men say. The sun that sets may rise again, but when our light has sunk into the earth, it is gone forever. Give me 1,000 kisses, then 100, another 1,000, another 100, and in one breath still kiss another 1,000, another 100. Pretty kind of wonderful stuff there. Passion and personal feelings that were not typical in Latin literature at the time, which were usually more like Ovid and inclining us towards instruction. From Virgil and his Georgics, we get the belief that in farming that nature is an architectural thing, or agricultural things are the example of peaceful rural poetry between tensions between the city and the natural. And he is also writing that something like an olive tree is presented in contrast to a vine. It requires little effort on the part of the farmer, and much of the book is extolling the simple country life over the corruptness of the city. Sounds kind of familiar today as well. In the Odes by Horace, the Horace's Odes are going to be really important later when we look at the poetry of Tennyson, who says that the Odes provide jewels 5 words long that stretch the forefinger of all time and sparkle forever. So there's a wide range of subjects in these poems: love, friendship, wine, religion, morality, patriotism, poems of eulogy addressed to Augustus and his relations, and verses written on a number of subjects and incidents. His Carpe Diem, seize the day, is a stoic acceptance, a way of accepting the stoic day. He says that how many years to you, to me, the gods will send us before they end us, nor questing fix your hopes on Babylonian horoscopes, learn to accept whatever it is to be. Rather Jove grant us many winters, or make of this his last, which splinters, now on opposing cliffs the Tuscan sea. In other words, seize the day, live today. Roman women in the empire are a little bit better off than Greek women were. They're not confined to the house like Athenian women in the archaic and classical periods. Wealthy women are traveling around the city in a litter carried by slaves, and they are meeting with friends. They are attending religious rites at temples. They can visit the baths. However, they are not holding government office. They are also not part of the military. In Roman architecture, we have a continuation of Greek and Etruscan temples, even larger in their engineering. They have also kind of perfected the arch. And we see in the Forum represents where the government is happening. And every new emperor is building a new basilica, a new building for the bureaucracy. And the Forum is very similar to the Mall in Washington, D.C. And in fact, Washington, D.C. is based kind of on the Roman Forum, where you have the centralized government. In the reign of Constantine, we are going to see a division in the empire from eastern to western halves, and he is also going to construct his Basilica of Maxentus in 312 AD, and this will be probably the largest of the basilicas. Everyday people, what are they living in architecturally? They are living in apartment buildings called insulas, where you have businesses on the first floor, and the poorer you are, the higher up on the floor, on the building you live. In other words, wealthy people do not live on the top floors because it's a lot of work to get up there. Wealthier people are living on the floors nearer to the ground floor. Very different than when the elevator is invented and how we live today. In Roman art, We get a new kind of portraiture that the Greeks didn't do. So, in their portraiture, we are seeing the effect of Stoicism, the effect of wisdom, and we are also seeing for the first time, since we've been looking at the Greeks and also the Roman copies, we are seeing individual people, and not individual idealized youth, but instead we are looking at wisdom. We are looking at the craggy faced ugliness that comes with getting old. And then that means that you have navigated a perilous life and that you've learned a few things. So the individual is being heralded in Roman art. In imperial Rome, we are seeing these imperial sculptures. This is the Augustus of Prima Porta. He is raising his arm in a gesture of leadership and imperial authority. At his feet are Cupid and a dolphin, and reminders of his alleged divine descent from Venus, the mother of Aeneas, Rome's legendary founder. His stance and physical proportions are modeled by Dorpheus that we studied in the classical Greek sculpture. So he is looking young, even though he's much older. He's idealized. He has a breastplate. He's a warrior, and he's in the contrapposto stance. He's looking very, very authoritative. In other architecture, like the Colosseum is built between 70 and 82 CE. There are a variety of blood sports, 3-level seatings. They have a beneath the floor complex of rooms and tunnels where athletes, gladiators, wild animals emerge to entertain the cheering crowd. We have a awning for shade. Each level of the exterior is framed by decorative and engraved columns. We see the orders of the Greeks, the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian, and an ingenious combination of arch and post-lintel structures. So this architectural genius we also see in their aqueducts that are slowly bringing water into Rome and into various territories, using the principle of the arch to make larger open spaces. And one of the great achievements also is the Pantheon, a temple that is based on the sphere, dedicated to 7 planetary deities. It was built in the early 2nd century CE with a monumental exterior that looks like a typical Greek building, but when you enter the precipice, you find this large circular dome with an oculus, and consisting and being made of about 5,000 tons of concrete. In fact, Roman concrete is still a bit of a mystery exactly and how it was made and what it's made of, and it has lasted for a couple of thousand years. So the concrete really solidly put together, solidly made. Rome also is known for its vacation destinations like Pompeii. And in fact, we know a lot about the Greeks because in 79, Mount Vesuvius in the background erupted and covered this vacation city with a layer of lava that left it in pretty good shape in terms of being intact to see what Roman buildings look like, what the city looked like. And we also found that when the bodies decayed, that they were able to take the cavities, fill them with plaster, and find actual people who were buried in the lava flow. I think in the Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii, we find some really great frescoes, which are paintings done on wet plaster. This one, we're seeing what appears to be some sort of festival, some Dionysus cult with specific rites and rituals, and they're having a party. In fact, this guy appears to be so drunk that his toga is falling off, And it appears that this woman here is coming to rescue him from the shame of being so drunk that he's nude. We're seeing a boy here playing some pipes, and it looks like a rollicking good time. The baths. So when we think about the Roman baths, and again, here's a reconstruction of the bath at Caracalla. It was one of the largest of the Roman public baths. These baths were also public libraries. It was about leisure, and again, also about bathing, hygiene. And we also find great, great art in here as well. One of the great sculptures that we have found is the Farnese Hercules. This figure is one of the more massively constructed marble sculptures. So what's interesting is when we were looking at the Greek sculptures, they were mostly made out of bronze. And then the marble sculptures that we were looking at in the last chapters are generally regarded as marble copies of the original bronzes from the Greeks. So the Greeks worked in bronzes primarily, and the Romans were all about cutting in stone and marble. And we'll continue to see that when we get to the Renaissance, when we look at Michelangelo as well. When you look at the Farnese Hercules, I think the one thing you begin to see is this massive bodybuilder in, again, a relaxed contrapposto state that looks very much like a very modern athlete today in terms of the potential mass of the body if you really work that body out well. So the kind of end of Rome, which we'll begin to look at Rome and the fall of Rome when we study Christianity in our next chapter. So there's this other phase of Rome when Rome goes from a culture of many gods, mostly copying the Greek and Roman gods, but also very tolerant of worship in general. You worship whatever you want as long as you also worship the emperor as a god. And the Jews and the Christians are not going to do that, and they're going to be tortured for it. However, Constantine, one of the great emperors and generals, he is going to Christianize Rome, and also in his conquests, he's going to split Rome into an east and a west. So the Eastern Rome will become the Byzantines. It basically is Greek-centered Rome. And the Byzantine Church is a Greek-centered church. Western Rome will be centered in Rome, and then he is going to figure that this will more efficiently be the center of bureaucracy for this very, very, very large empire. And of course, anytime you have a very large empire, it is eventually going to crumble. From Constantine, we begin to see the abandonment of classicism in art, the kind of classicism that gives us the sculpture of the Farnese Hercules. Again, proportions and kind of exactitudes in the body, to later more Christian myths where the bodies are condensed and we are no longer interested in these nude bodies anymore, because in Catholic theology, we are going to find from Augustine that the body is inherently profane and the soul is good. So we see less of an interest in showing the body accurately, instead just telling stories. The fall of Rome, how it falls and begins to collapse, there's a number of things. There have been theories that go from soil exhaustion, lead poisoning, a malaria epidemic. Probably no one thing is responsible, but rather a slow decline of invading other people's land and not having the money and the infrastructure for the armies to hold off attack, especially when you have wealthy cities like Rome who can't protect themselves from the ultimate Eastern barbarians, the Vandals, the Goths, and the Visigoths, all the people that are going to make up the Northern Europe, and we'll see them in the Northern Renaissance, they are ultimately going to come down and raid Rome, and they're generally considered to be farmers and raiders, and this is going to lead to a decline and then ultimately a fall in 476 when a Germanic army commander disposes the reigning Roman emperor in the west, Romulus Augustulus, and the empire will fall. Once there's no more armies, once there's no more central government, the whole thing will kind of fall apart. So as I mentioned, make sure you do your reading assessments, do them thoroughly, and then depending if this is a summer class or a fall or spring class, fall or spring, this assignment's mandatory. Summer, it is optional. What I would like you to do is I would like you to compare Roman and Greek sculpture, and I would like you to look at Augusta Suprema Porta. There's a short video here from the veristic, that realistic portraiture that we were looking at, and I want you to describe what it is that you're seeing in the videos, and I also want you to kind of compare them and talk about what you can glean from these sculptures in their society. If you need a refresher on Greek sculpture, where the Romans are coming from, there's a video on the Kouros and the Archaic, on the classical, and on the Hellenistic style. All three of these videos are about 5 minutes. It doesn't take a lot of time. I would say look at all three of these, then watch these 2 videos before you begin the assignment. I look forward to seeing what you have to say about the sculpture. I'm also looking forward to see what you have to say about Roman culture from our reading. And of course, the first question is always asking, what's your favorite part of the chapter? I'm always interested in knowing what are you most engaged with when you're reading about this stuff. I'll talk to you soon when we go over chapter 4. See you later.